Today we're going to talk about synth bass. So what's a synth bass? Well, a synthesizer is an instrument that generates a sound using an electrical signal. You can sculpt it and shape it into almost anything you can imagine. It's a really versatile instrument. One of the things that it does really well is it can make some really thick and potent bass sounds. You can also accomplish a similar goal by using pedals with your electric bass, but I think there's something to be said for learning to play a keyboard synthesizer instrument as a bass player. So today we're going to talk about some of the reasons that I think synth bass is cool, and you can decide for yourself if you think it's worth learning. The first reason I think synth bass is cool has to do with the technology used to create the sound. So quick refresh, how does an electric bass create a sound? Well, an electric bass has a string that vibrates, and that vibration resonates wood, and that vibration and that resonance is picked up by a pickup using magnets, and that resonance and that sound is converted into an electrical signal which is sent to a preamplifier and is amplified through a speaker. So we hear the sound of a vibrating string against wood amplified. I love this sound. It's one of my favorite sounds in the world, and I've spent a lot of time enjoying it. But it is a fairly one-dimensional sound. At the end of the day, it is a string vibrating against wood, and we can take that sound and we can manipulate it in all sorts of different ways, but that is what it is, and that's a good thing. But I think a synthesizer is super cool because it creates sound in a different way. So instead of a actual vibrating string against wood, a synthesizer is generating the sound, and you, as the operator of this machine, can sculpt and shape and change that sound, its tone and its timbre, and also you can shape the note itself in terms of how quickly the note responds, its attack, its decay, its sustain, the actual life of the note that you hear. You can change the shape, and then you can control it using a keyboard. So it's a really nuanced instrument. But in terms of bass sounds, you can also create some sounds that you can't create with an electric bass. Like, for example, you can have a note that lasts forever, has no decay. You can have a huge bass note playing the root of the chord that just lasts over 4 measures, right? Or you could have a super punchy note that's almost percussive. You could have a note that when you play it, you hear the initial sound and then it opens up a filter, and then the sound changes as you play it, right? What I'm getting at is it's a very nuanced instrument that can create lots of different sounds, different bass sounds, and some bass sounds that you couldn't create with an electric bass. So that leads me to the second reason that I think a synth bass is cool. And that's that it's not just a synth bass, it is a synthesizer that can create all kinds of different sounds, not just bass sounds. Maybe that's not interesting to you. Maybe you just want to focus on bass right now. And if that's the case, that's okay. I think that's a very worthy endeavor. But maybe you're interested in production. Maybe you're interested in sound design. Maybe you're interested in learning more about different facets of music besides just the bass. It's sort of a window. I started getting into synth bass because I was like, I want to emulate some of these famous bass sounds from the 70s and the 80s that I just can't get with the electric bass. But then through that, it opened me up to all kinds of sounds that I didn't know that I wanted to create, but then I started to experiment and be creative with music in different ways aside from just bass playing. So not only does it create cool bass sounds, but it can create all kinds of sounds. So that leads me to a third reason that I think synth bass is cool, and that's that if you choose to learn this instrument, you're going to start getting better at keyboards or piano. And that is something that is never going to hurt you as a musician. Maybe you're not interested in learning piano, maybe you're not interested in learning keyboards. That's okay. And you know, I wasn't really for a long time either. Actually, starting to learn piano is something that wouldn't have happened for me if I hadn't gotten a synthesizer. And I was learning scales. I remember I was in the van on the road with the band. I had a little MIDI keyboard that I kept with me in the van, and I would practice my pentatonic scales, and I would practice major and minor scales in different keys, just starting to get the muscle memory of playing different patterns on a keyboard so that I could play synth bass. But then I started to realize, wow, it's fun to play chords. It's fun to experiment with different sounds and stacking notes with a keyboard. Because of learning synth bass, it's opened up my world to another instrument. And I think as you are growing in your music career, no matter where you're at, I think having some fundamental keyboard or piano knowledge is going to really help you in the long run. And I think you should start looking into that sooner than later. I wish I had learned piano much sooner than I did. But here I am, and I'm learning it now. But you have the opportunity, no matter where you're at in your career, is to go ahead and get a little synthesizer and start to practice. And I promise you, you won't regret learning those fundamental musical skills. So a fourth reason that I think synth bass is cool is that you can play music the way that it was recorded. There are a lot of songs everybody knows and everybody loves that were originally recorded with a synthesizer for the bass line. And if you can play the music that way, people can feel it. And I started doing that, where I would go to these wedding gigs or party gigs or bar gigs where there'd be a full dance floor, there'd be hundreds of people on the dance floor, and you can launch into a song with the original bass sound blasting full blast through the subwoofers, and people, they can feel it and they can connect with it. And you can do that too with an electric bass, but I do think there's something to be said for playing those songs the way they were written, and I think people can connect with it. And I think too, as a bass player, it's a way that you can bring something of value to the table that can set you apart. I think some of my band members on those gigs noticed it and would talk to me about it, and I think it got me some respect in that community for bringing the synth bass to the gig and playing it. So it's not something that you have to do, but I think it's something that's valuable, and it's something that if you learn it, it can only benefit you. Another reason that I think synth bass is cool is it can help save your hands. I remember a few years ago, I was playing bass full time at the time. It was the only way that I made money, and I remember I had a severe left hand injury, and I had to pull back from playing bass entirely for a couple of months to try and give my hand a chance to heal. But I had a tour lined up, and I remember I went to the band leader and I asked, what do you think if I play this gig on synth bass? And it wasn't music that typically would be played with a synth bass, but you can use a synth bass to dial in like a nice warm fundamental note with nice sustain that can actually, in the mix, sound a lot like an electric bass. And because I had the instrument and I had the skill set ready to go, I was able to keep working while my left hand was resting. Remember, I went on the road with a splint on my left hand. I just used my hand to change knobs and to change settings, and I played all of the bass lines with my right hand. So I was really thankful that I had that skill set, and that enabled me to keep working while I was healing. Synth bass can also be especially helpful if you're playing long gigs, party gigs, wedding gigs, bar gigs where you're playing for 3 or 4 or 5 hours at a time. It can give you a chance to switch back and forth between electric bass and synth bass between songs, or even between sections of songs, to give your hands a break, especially if you've been playing a lot and you already had 2 or 3 long gigs that weekend, or you're recovering from an injury like I was. Being able to switch to synth bass can be really, really helpful to give yourself a chance to rest and get your bearings as you get into the next song. Okay, so here's a bonus section for you. Maybe you're interested in starting to learn synth bass, but you're not sure where to get started. So the very first gig I ever did on synth bass, I actually just borrowed a friend's MIDI keyboard and I played stock Logic sounds, and the gig ended up going great. So what I'm getting at is you don't necessarily need to own a synthesizer to get started. Or if you can't even borrow or buy a MIDI keyboard, you could just go find a free piano on Craigslist and just start learning keyboards. And then that way, when you can't afford a synthesizer, you've already got some of the work done. You've already learned some of those fundamental skills. It's easy for us to make excuses with our progress with music because of gear or not being able to afford gear. And I would encourage you to not let yourself do that. Use what you have, use the tools and resources that you have, and just take the next step. If you're interested in buying a synthesizer, a good affordable option to get started would be something like the Novation bass station. It's a really cool analog synth that's got some great bass sounds. If you want to take a step up from there, there's something like the Sub Phatty by Moog. Moog is an amazing company. Bob Moog pioneered synthesis, and the company continues to make great instruments today. So you could look at the Sub Phatty. If you want to take a step up from that, there's something like the Sub 37, which is has a bigger keyboard, and it's just a more powerful synthesizer. So those are both great options. Another thing you could do is you could look for a used synthesizer. So I got this this Moog Prodigy. This is a 1979, and I love it. I think vintage synths have their own unique character. They're really warm and gritty and have their own vibe about them. But they're harder to find, and people don't like to sell them. They like to hold on to them. So you might have to wait a little bit until you can find a good option. But there's some really cool vintage synths out there that have amazing bass sounds that you can find. And actually, they might not be all that expensive when you compare them to the new ones. You just have to know what you're looking for. So I would encourage you just take the next step, whatever that looks like for you. And yeah, I don't think you'll regret it. I think synth bass is super fun, and it's a worthwhile thing to start learning. So thanks for hanging out today, and I'll see you on the next video.